Hi, students. Today we are going to begin our final exam review. So, as a reminder, your final exam in history this year is going to be on the last six chapters that we learned as a class. So, where that sort of leads us to begin is chapter six, which is the first three presidents and the beginning of politics in the United States. So, just as a refresher, as a reminder, everything that we did before that, colonial America, the Revolutionary War, the Constitution, all that stuff will not be on the final exam. Okay. So we're basically going to make it easier for you. We're going to test you on everything that we did pretty much the second half of the school year. Okay. So with that being said, why don't we jump in? So the first question that you're going to have to answer on your final is what were the first two political parties in the United States? So the answer to that question, which you're going to write in, is the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. So remember, like we have two parties today, Democrats, Republicans. Those were not the first two political parties in the United States. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about these parties, try to refresh your memory, get some of this to stick. Okay, so in the 1790s, the party that was founded by Alexander Hamilton, who wanted a strong U.S. government, called themselves the Federalists. Okay. So the Federalists, federal government, strong government for the country. The other party, the Democratic Republicans, they were founded by Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson was of the belief that every state should be able to do whatever it wants. And that we call that belief today states' rights. So 1790s, you have two parties. One believes in a strong U.S. government. One believes in a weak U.S. government. Okay, Federalists, Democratic Republicans, Alexander Hamilton versus Thomas Jefferson. Okay, so now let's move on to the first president of the United States, George Washington. There is quite a bit that I could ask you about the presidency of George Washington. But we're going to really focus on the big things in terms of the George Washington presidency. So the next question on your final exam review says, what were the two most, what was the most important example set by the presidency of George Washington? George Washington did so much as president. All right. He establishes how a president acts. He establishes what a president wears. He establishes what a president does, the whole office. But for this question, you're going to write in on your study guide, leaving after two terms. So it wasn't so much what Washington did as president. That stuff was important. But it's that after serving two terms in office, after serving 8 years as president, George Washington walked away. That was sort of unprecedented in the history of the world. Usually, when somebody took over as the king or as the dictator or as the emperor or as the leader of a country, that person would stay in that job for as long as they lived. So, for George Washington to be president, to serve his two terms, and then to walk away and then let somebody else do the job, that set the precedent for our country that whoever was in charge would only be in charge for a short amount of time. And that's basically one of the most important aspects of American democracy. All right, so let's keep moving on here. All right. So there is another big thing that Washington establishes that we still have today that was mentioned nowhere in the U.S. Constitution. Okay. So the next question on your study guide asks about something called a presidential cabinet. Okay. So when George Washington takes over as president, Washington is well aware that he is in charge, but Washington is not an expert on everything. So what he establishes is a group of advisors called the cabinet. So in a very simple answer, a cabinet is a group of advisors who basically tell the president what to do in a number of areas. So, for example, the president needs economic advice. That's the Secretary of the Treasury. The president needs advice when it comes to relationships with foreign countries. We call that person today the Secretary of State. The president may need help when it comes to military matters. In this time period, they called that person the Secretary of War. Today, we call that person the Secretary of Defense. But all things considered, presidents need help. They need advice. They need to be told what to do by experts. And we call that group of experts the presidential cabinet. That group of advisors was founded and created by George Washington. So you should know, out of those cabinet members, a couple of the more famous ones. So the next question on your study guide asks, who was the first Secretary of State? You should know that the first ever Secretary of State was Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was named Secretary of State because Jefferson had spent time in London and he had spent time in Paris. And because of that, George Washington felt like Jefferson had a good grasp on Europe, foreign countries, and what to do with Britain and France. The other very important member of Washington's first cabinet, and I would argue the most important member of Washington's first cabinet, was his Secretary of Treasury. And on your study guide, you want to write down that the first ever Secretary of the Treasury was Alexander Hamilton. And Alexander Hamilton gave George Washington advice when it came to economic issues. And you should know that the economics of the United States was a mess when George Washington took over as first president. We had a lot of debt. We had a lot of economic issues that were still kind of hanging around from the Revolutionary War. So what Alexander Hamilton did was he created an economic plan for the United States that basically allowed the United States to fix its economy, move forward, and basically help Washington handle debt, banking, factories, all of these looming economic issues that would later go on to become huge issues, in American politics. Okay, so let's talk about one aspect of that economic plan that really lived on throughout history. And this plan was called Hamilton's Assumption Plan. Now, the key thing here is that the word assumption, this related to debt. So the Hamilton's Assumption Plan was basically Hamilton's debt plan. What to do with the debt of the United States. So make sure on your study guide you know that Hamilton's Assumption Plan was the belief to combine all the individual state debts into one national debt. So what do I mean by that? At this time, in the 1790s, there were 13 states in the country. And each one of those states had its own debts from the Revolutionary War. So Hamilton believed that to move forward as a country, the only way that we could do that successfully was to take the debts of all 13 states and combine them into one United States debt. So you might wonder, who cares? Why is that a big problem? Why is that even an issue in the first place? Well, think about it, right? Every state owed a different amount of money. And there was this belief among some people that every state should pay back the amount of debt that it had, right? Like individual responsibility. But Hamilton's argument was that we were a country now and that we had to start solving problems as a country and not as individual states anymore. So this was a huge deal. And just be aware that this is after the Revolutionary War, after we had fought this war, after we had gained independence, and now we had this huge debt problem to solve. Now, here's the problem with the debt plan. Okay, Hamilton did not have enough votes in Congress to get his debt plan passed. So this led to one of the first major compromises in U.S. politics. So on your study guide, it says it's going to ask you about the Assumption Plan Compromise. Okay, so there's two parts to this. The first part of the compromise is that Federalists and Hamilton would pass their debt plan. They would combine all the state debts into one debt. That's part one. But here was the big part of the compromise. The enemies of Hamilton's debt plan wanted something in return. So the Democratic Republicans, what they got, if you look at this picture here, they were able to determine the location of the United States Capitol. So Democratic Republicans wanted the national capital to be placed somewhere near Virginia. So once again, the compromise that was passed was that Hamilton got his debt plan in exchange for Democratic Republicans being able to choose the location of the capital, which ended up being near Virginia. Okay, debt plan in exchange for the capital. That's what you should know for this one. All right, there is one more major event in the George Washington presidency that you should know about. Okay, and this event happens in 1794. One of Hamilton's economic plans was to pass a tax on whiskey, and that plan backfired. So the next question on your study guide asks you about something called the Whiskey Rebellion. So farmers in western Pennsylvania rioted in 1794. And why were they rioting? They were protesting taxes on whiskey. Now, this event was a major test of the new government. So why was it significant? George Washington had to use the United States military to ride out to western Pennsylvania and basically put down the rebellion and get the farmers to pay their taxes. So what happened? George Washington and Alexander Hamilton rode out to western Pennsylvania with an army of roughly 15,000 men. When the rebels saw that an army led by Hamilton and Washington was coming to get them, the rebellion fell apart and the rebels went home. So basically, the reason why this event is so important is it showed that the new U.S. government could survive a crisis situation. And this basically proved that our new government, the United States, could survive for the long term. Now, there will be a few questions on your final exam about the second and third presidents of the United States. The second president of the United States was John Adams. And largely, John Adams is not considered a good president. Specifically, there is one set of laws that is passed while John Adams is president that historians look back on, and they really think that these laws were a mistake. So the next question on your study guide deals with something called the Alien and Sedition Acts. The part of these laws that is the most historically significant is the Alien and Sedition Act said that as an American, you could not criticize the government. You could not criticize the president. You could not criticize the Congress. So what was said was that if you criticize the government, you could be fined or you could be put in jail. So our Constitution has the First Amendment, which is really, really important. First Amendment says freedom of religion for all Americans, freedom of speech for all Americans. So in 1798, John Adams, the second president of the United States, signed a law into effect saying that it was illegal to criticize the government. Him and the Congress violated the First Amendment, and as a result of this, history does not look back very kindly on the second president, John Adams. Now let's move on to the third president of the United States. So John Adams was a one-term president. And after John Adams serves one term, he runs again but loses. And John Adams loses to Thomas Jefferson, his own vice president. So Thomas Jefferson serves 8 years in office. There is one thing, though, one major event that happens during the presidency of Thomas Jefferson that you must know for your final exam. And that is the Louisiana Purchase. Let's look at this map real quick, right? So around the year 1800, this area here was the United States. And then in 1803, we bought this area called Louisiana from France. So what we essentially did was we doubled the size of the United States. And not only did we double the size of the United States, but we did it for a really cheap amount of money. So Jefferson was able to buy this entire territory of Louisiana, including New Orleans down here, for $15 million. So if you break that down by acre of land, we basically doubled the size of our country for only 3 cents an acre. So that was like a once in a lifetime land deal. Jefferson makes that deal. He doubles the size of our country. And as a result, generally, we tend to view Jefferson as a pretty decent president, pretty good president. Okay, guys, so those are your first 10 questions of your final exam. If you need to rewind the video, go back, look at anything you can. Make sure you have everything filled out, and we'll work on the next bunch of questions tomorrow. Okay? Have a good day, all.